Hey guys, welcome back to another Prepared. Let's talk about this situation with Mr. Abadi. Now, when I think about being behind enemy lines, I often think about my experiences in Afghanistan, where they're both the most beautiful experiences I've ever had, also a mix of the most chaotic experiences I ever had. I mean, the fire base I was at for my first rotation to Afghanistan was in a remote town near Nureh. Nureh is south of Barakout, east of the Hindu Kush mountain range, and also south of Kamdesh. It's on the border of the Pak-Afghan border and the northeastern part of the country. When I think about my experiences there, I remember thinking, wow, this place is majestic. It's so beautiful. The people are so free. Oh yeah, you're behind enemy lines. You're on a fire base with a dozen Americans right next to a river, right next to a road, the only road in and out that runs north-south, wedged in between two mountain ranges that have high ground, surrounded by enemy personnel that love to lob rockets and kill Americans. Everywhere you go, everybody knows the ICOM chatter, the radio chatter was constant when you left the fire base, and at any point, you could be blown up or ambushed by enemy personnel. So when I started reading about doctrine from fire-based defense plans in Vietnam, I realized, man, this isn't normal. Like, I'm not staged by an airport with my helicopters. I don't have the convenience of having security everywhere and then having a sovereign and safe place to be able to plan, prep, and then launch from. Constantly exposed to enemy personnel. And if you're a veteran who served in Afghanistan, you know what that feeling feels like. It's like a wild feeling, but it's also beautiful. It's like, man, this is awesome. It's like the Wild West, but it's certainly dangerous. So the level of preparedness that you went through was much more robust than your normal routines in operating in Iraq, for example. You just had to do things differently. You had to do logistics for food, for water, for electricity, for fuel. And it was just a different life. Now, what does this crazy analogy have to do with anything when it compares to living in the United States? Well, there's never been a time in history where we've had it so good, but we've given away so much of our freedom for that good. Governments are incentivized by taking over more control, by growing, inflating, and getting really bloated. The more bloated they are, the harder they are to control, and then they just start stripping away freedoms. And so a lot of that comes from a feeling inside of us, like, man, it just doesn't feel right. You're getting all these pieces of information, you're like, ugh. But more so in human history, especially in my life and your life, those feelings have manifested and materialized in tangible things going wrong. Take an open border, for example, where you don't have a porous border anymore. You have open borders, and it's deliberate. It's on purpose, because through executive action right now, we could stop it. We could turn everybody away. We certainly turn Haitians away. Why aren't we doing it? Well, because there's some nefarious reasons, whether it's related to the election or related to the downfall of our society. I mean, we could sit here and go down conspiracy rabbit holes, but let's just talk about what it means in your everyday life in security and this fire base analogy that I talk about. Right now, with an open border, you have tens of thousands of likely nefarious fighting age males who are in our country to do us harm. These are the ones that we've caught. As of recent, only a little bit over a week ago, we rolled a guy up who went by the name of Mr. Abadi. I mean, Mr. Abadi apparently told investigators he had interest in leaving the group because he didn't want to kill people. That's a terrorist group. Though he added that once you're in, you can never get out. Nevertheless, Abadi was placed into isolation and interrogated by the Tactical Terrorism Response Team after making terrorist threats. If an individual poses a potential threat to national security or public safety, we deny admission, detain, remove, or refer them to other federal agencies for further vetting, investigation, and or prosecution as appropriate. How convenient, U.S. Border Patrol, that if somebody makes a threat, you actually do something about it. And that includes likely deportation. So Mr. Body came into the country, and he willingly admitted that he was going to New York, and he was a bomb maker. He says, and I quote, "I'm going to try to make a bomb." Like, he said that out loud, guys. I'm going to try to make a bomb. He also didn't want to kill people, but he said he's going to try to make a bomb because he's a terrorist who's affiliated with a terrorist organization who wants to do our country harm. Now, I imagine here, when you look on the aptitude or intellectual scale, Mr. Body is not at the top of the list. Typically, the bomb guys, the guys who either make bombs or blow themselves up, aren't necessarily the most intelligent. So what does this look like in scale? Well, in 2022, according to a report, border agents encountered 98 individuals who were on a terrorist watch list. In 2023, that was 172. And in the first few months of 24, border agents have encountered 59 individuals. Now, just to give you some perspective here, if you're on a terrorist watch list, you likely had the run-in with Interpol, International Police, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, some counter-terrorist entity that has put you into the database. When you're put into the database, that database is accessible by all the countries who are in agreement with obviously regulating this kind of thing. So to give you some perspective on how efficient this is, I was on the terrorist watch list. Not to be confused with the incident where the Department of Justice, through the FBI, through a rogue analyst, put me on a domestic watch list. I was actually on a terrorist watch list. When I was in Special Forces in the Guard component in 19th Special Forces Group, I was a sergeant major in the great state of Texas. As a sergeant major, I was also a full-time contractor for the CIA. Now imagine I go overseas to Yemen, I come back, put on a military uniform, and I'm overseas to Africa. And I'm rotating like this back and forth. With a military ID, I'm going overseas in a military capacity. And with a government ID, I'm going overseas in a government capacity. Except the government, as a contractor at least, isn't talking to anybody. And the only thing that TSA sees is you have a civilian named Mike Glover who's rotating overseas to potentially do nefarious things, like get my foreign fighting on. And so every time I came back from overseas, I would have to show identification after I got pulled into secondary and communicate that I wasn't a bad guy. I showed my military ID, showed my government ID, and that became problematic while every single time I was traveling domestically, I was getting pulled into secondary by TSA. Until I had an incident where I said, "What's going on?" And the TSA supervisor literally told me I was on a domestic terrorist watch list. And because I was getting these numbers, these numerical sequence of numbers, and being pulled in secondary for just traveling in the continental United States, he told me I was getting pulled into secondary because I was on the list. So I made phone calls. And finally, those phone calls landed me off the list. There were even incidents when I was back home in Colorado at the time where my cell phone would heat up and it would illuminate, meaning it would activate because there would be a surge of technology exploiting my cell phone. How do I know that? Because I used to do it for a living. I mean, technically, I didn't do it for a living. The great SOT-As, the great SIGINT, signal intelligence experts, electronic warfare experts did it for us. But that's how you exploit. You use assets, you use resources and means to go after bad guys. So in this case, I was the bad guy. How dumb are we that the U.S. government and all of its inefficiencies is targeting Americans, putting them on terrorist watch list when they're actually patriots serving their country? Not to say there aren't bad guys on the list, because Ibadi seems like a bad guy who was on the list. I actually don't know if he was on the list. He was pulled into secondary, but I don't know if he was on the list or because he said he was going to make a bomb that put him on the list. Now, what's going to happen to Ibadi? Who knows? He might just be released based on the incompetence of the government. Now, the reason I bring this up, and it's so important to talk about, is because what does that mean for us? And what the hell does an analogy about a fire base behind enemy lines have to do with anything, Mike? Well, it's simple. You are very comfortable and complacent in your place. Whether that's your home, your town, maybe your state. I feel safe in Utah. I mean, relatively speaking, comparable to states and inner cities, it's safe. But if you live, for example, in San Francisco, are you safe? Or do you just feel safe in the confines of your home, where the walls that surround you make you feel safe, but are you actually safe? Where more people die from drug overdoses on the streets of San Francisco than most places in the country, where crime is rampant because of policy. So you had a feeling, and that has materialized into actual things that are taking place in our country, like an open border, like millions of people who are unaccounted for, who we don't know why they're here, that have slipped through the cracks because they're not admitting that they have bombs they're going to make. They're just prepared. The segue of our conversation, I want to talk about speedballs. Now, if you're in the military, you might know what speedballs are. I know what speedballs are. I packed them. I've actually supplied them, and I've received them. A speedball is a piece of kit, typically filled with water and ammunition, that you're resupplied with during the conduct of an operation to sustain your operation, because you might be in a gunfight. And so when you get a speedball in task force, it's typically done by helicopters, where a Little Bird or MH-60 will come in and drop the kit and then take off. You could get that kit, redistribute it amongst the men, and then go back to the fight. What is your plan, hypothetically speaking, if something went really bad? Like if one of these rogue actors detonated a bomb, kicked some things off, and then do you have the ability to upgrade your circumstance? If you were doing a low-vis operation, which is the best way to kind of tie this together. For example, if I was in plain clothes, indigenous clothes, doing an operation behind enemy lines, I wouldn't want to give away my signature by like communicating overtly. So I wouldn't have a radio to my head talking into it, or peltors in a helmet talking through my push-to-talk. I would want to do covert communications through cell phone infrastructure, through dead drops, through covert means. Well, why is that important? And what does that mean for us, civilians? We don't want to have body armor sitting next to your place of work, right? You don't want to sit it next to your desk unless you work at Fieldcraft Survival. You could do that. But you don't want to just telegraph all these things. It's like the difference between overt carry and covert carry. Open carry, there's a time and place because you want to mitigate or reduce risk, but it also increases risk depending on the environment you're in. I want you to have your own speedballs and be prepared for the worst case scenario, to don equipment and potentially go to the fight in a more broad and more evolved way. That's right. I want that for you. And I want that for you because I want it for me. I already have my speedball. Now, I'm going to recommend a 20-liter or 40-liter loadout for a speedball. And if you're a member of my Patreon, you're going to get that content. I'll talk about it today, just principally based. But I also am going to do it for my channel, which is free, on IG. I don't have anything to sell you except the bag, except the partitioning of it. But you could do that with anything you have. I mean, in fact, the more low-vis the bag is, meaning the more it fits in, the better off you likely are. Now, this is different than a disaster bag prep, because if you're prepping a disaster bag, it's the components to deal with a natural disaster post the bad situation. And most of that has to do with sustaining, I don't know, water, food, basic shelter, necessity. But in a speedball, I want you to be prepared to fight. So that's going to look a lot different. So when I was in GRS, I used to have this belt, which is why I have it on the table here. I would have this belt loaded out with all of the necessities of things that I needed to carry on my person and survive. First contact and potentially sustained contact for at least a couple days, right? So if I was in a gunfight, got displaced from my vehicle, but had this equipment plus my speedball, plus my bug out bag. I mean, a speedball is a more robust way of saying I'm taking care of my family. So the consideration isn't just kit, body armor, and those type of things, because that's kind of for yourself. In a speedball, I'm worried about the team. In this case, your family. Principally, I can't acknowledge that speedballs are important for civilians without talking about building out your med capability. If you're in a disaster, let's take the Boston Marathon bombing, where 2 bombs in coordination with one another went off and devastated all the civilians that were around those pressure-cooked bombs. The entire purpose of that was to kill and maim, to cause mass casualties. And it worked. It definitely was a mass casualty. Imagine you're in a situation where these bad guys go rogue. You're going to need to be able to treat mass casualties, including your family. I know that's scary to think about. It breaks my heart even talking about this, because that could be an eventuality. Having a more robust setup to treat trauma, TCCC-based things, separate from disaster, which are Band-Aids and bacitracin, is the way that we navigate this. So my main priorities are security, surviving first contact, sustaining my capability in my defense, and treating first aid and mass casualties. We're gonna go with those principles, talk about them, and digest them as we go through content and education on those platforms that I talked about. Rewilding is happening in April. Guys, it's happening in South Carolina. It's the first time that I've done rewilding on the East Coast. We're doing it with Bert Soren at his farm. Bert Soren is the founder of Sorenex and Sorenex Outdoors. It's about building resilience in you. It's about building skills and community, getting back to tribe principles. I'll have that linked for you down below. We only have a few slots remaining. Also, I want you to come out for the Gunfighter Weekend, both pistol and carbine, in Tabiona, Utah. We've teamed up with Skyrider Ranch, which is a beautiful location, isolated, but plenty of real estate. We got 14 miles of river. We have ranges out to 1,000 yards. We're going to do pistol, carbine, and overnighter, and also have fireside chats building your resilience. I'll be accompanied by my professor at Fieldcraft Jiu-Jitsu, Greg Lappin, and you'll have a good time at the lodge. I'll make sure I link that down below. Guys, I'm off to the underground to tell you how I really feel, going a little bit in the weeds about this speedball build-out. I appreciate you guys. Until next time, peace out, guys.